Hello, and welcome to the Brilliant Writer Book Chat. Today we are talking about the book Make It Stick by Peter Brown and Friends. And it's a book about learning, about refuting some common learning myths that people still believe to this day, but has been refuted by science, which not very many people are aware of. So we're going to go through a few myths that are presented and debunked in this book, and then talk about some of the best actual methods for learning, and then some more principles that I found really interesting about this book, and then end with some action items, things that you can actually apply to your writing. So let's get started. First, let's start with the common myths. There's actually more than 3, but I just picked out the few that I thought were the most salient. The first one is the concept of learning styles. So I think it was Howard Gardner who popularized the idea that people have different learning styles. Some people are more visual, some people are more auditory, some people like to learn this way and that way, and there's musical and there's natural and something. Anyways, turns out all of that is not supported by the evidence. So don't go trying to, let's say, design your learning experience based on that theory, because it's just a theory and there haven't been rigorous scientific studies proving that it actually works. It's really just the idea of this one guy who came up with it, and, maybe good for him, but it doesn't actually work in real life. So in reality, the methods that are presented in this book work for everyone. Maybe to different degrees, perhaps, or maybe the effectiveness depends on how well you understand and apply it, but don't worry about the learning styles thing. The second one is the concept of massed practice. So a lot of students like to practice cramming before a test. And even in sports or music or other areas, people like to practice a certain skill or read a textbook over and over again, or in one giant chunk. And it turns out that doesn't actually work very well, because what ends up happening is that you're storing the knowledge in your short-term memory, where it easily goes away and it doesn't really stick to you. It doesn't really change your brain, so to speak. So massed practice doesn't work. The third one is judging your own learning. So human beings, we're just really bad at being able to assess how much we learn. I mean, there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is where people who don't know very much about a topic mistakenly think they know a lot about the topic. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. The less you know, the more you think you know. And that's true for learning new skills and information as well. You tend to assume you know something because it seems familiar, when in reality, you don't. And that's just one of the ways that our brains deceive us. So we have to be very careful with that. Now let's talk about some of the actual methods for learning that work according to the science as presented in this book. So the first one is called interleaving. And interleaving is basically you practice skills in sandwiched order. So instead of, let's say, for example, if you're learning, say, piano, instead of trying to work on scales for 10 minutes, and then you work on arpeggios for 10 minutes, and then you work on sight reading for 10 minutes, and so on and so forth. You take a few minutes to work on scales, and then you stop, and then you move on to sight reading, and then you move on to arpeggios, and then you come back to arpeggios, and then you go on to a different skill, and then you come back to... And so basically you just keep switching it up. And one example that they gave of this in the book was a guy who was learning hockey, and he said it was really frustrating working with his coach, because his coach would have them practice one hockey skill and then move on to the next hockey skill before he felt like he had even mastered the first one. But that's the point. You're trying to keep the brain constantly a little frustrated, because it turns out that real life is like this. In real life, when you are applying knowledge to actually do something, whether it's calculate your grocery bill at the store, or perform some musical or sports thing, like playing a basketball game or something like that, your opponents are not going to stand there and watch you practice your dribbling for 10 minutes. You're constantly on the run. There's lots of things happening all at once. And so in real life, you are actually interleaving things just naturally. So when you're practicing, you need to practice interleaving, because there's this quote that says, practice the way you play and you'll play the way you practice. And that works in every domain. So another thing that goes with interleaving is spacing out your practice, because it turns out that you need to have a little bit of time to forget. And the reason why you need to forget is related to the second thing on this list, which is effortful learning. Turns out learning should be difficult. It should actually take effort. It shouldn't be easy. and it shouldn't feel like very like a walk in the park, let's say. And so the idea is, when people study, they tend to like to read their textbook or whatever it is, the source material, over and over again. What that does is you don't actually really learn a whole lot doing that. You just get a sense of fluency, which means that you feel like the text is familiar. But that doesn't mean that you actually understand the concept underneath that word, vocab word, or whatever it is that you're trying to learn. And so, because the reason why is that you're storing things in your short-term memory, and real learning occurs when knowledge is solidly embedded in your long-term memory, and it's hooked to your other memories and the other things that you already know. And so what needs to happen for somebody to really master a topic is for them to store it in their long-term memory and then bring it back to their conscious memory when they need it, and then apply it to some relevant, meaningful problem. And as they're doing that in conscious memory, their brains are actually kind of changing the memories a little bit, adding more context, hooking it to more knowledge that they have, and then putting it back in long-term memory. And as you do this more and more, that memory becomes really solid in your long-term memory, and then you've mastered that topic or that skill. So learning should be effortful. Don't rely on a feeling of, oh, I've seen this before, so I know it, because you don't. And then the third thing is called the testing effect. Now, the thing that's interesting about testing is that it helps in two different ways. Number one, it helps you to assess where you actually are. So kind of like how we said before that people are really bad at telling how much they actually know, judging your learning. The testing effect, so using quizzes, using self-tests, can help you objectively know how much you really understand. Whereas when you just look at a vocab word and you're like, oh, I think I know that, in reality, you probably don't. But when you test yourself and say, okay, do I really know this? Let me write down the answer and see if I actually know this. You'll find that you know less than you think. And so that's one way that the testing effect helps you, is it gives you a good gauge of where you really are. And then the second way that it helps you is pre-testing. So it turns out that if you test yourself on a topic before you've even learned about the topic, it helps you learn the topic better. Like, for example, in a lot of textbooks, they give you sample problems at the end of the chapter. If you go to those sample problems and you attempt to do them, math problems or science or whatever it is, before you even read the chapter, that primes your brain so that it's able to absorb the relevant information when you get to it later. So I found that really interesting. Anyways, let's move on to the next part. 3 more principles. So aside from myths debunked and actual learning strategies introduced, the book also talks about a few other principles of learning and memory that I thought were really interesting. So the first one, I just wrote memory, but basically they were talking about how memory is malleable, and it's something that our brains work on. And I kind of covered this already, but basically the idea is we've got short-term memory, we've got long-term memory, we've got basically a type of fluid memory. Is it fluid memory? I don't remember the exact term that they use, but knowledge can be knowledge of skills that's kind of fluid, and then there's crystallized knowledge, which is just built on the stuff you learned before. So one thing about learning is the more you know, the more you can learn. For example, people who are polyglots, when they learn their first language, it's hard because this is the first time they're trying it. They don't know what works. But once they've mastered their first language and they're learning their second language, it's a little easier. And then when they go into their third, their fourth, the fifth, the 10th language, by the time they get to like language number 10, they've got their system down. They understand how languages work. It's a lot easier to learn your 10th language than it is to learn your first or second language, because they have so much background knowledge on how language learning works. And they've got 9 other languages. So there are a lot of connections between languages, especially if you stay within the same language family. Like if you're trying to learn Japanese after you already know Chinese, that's a huge benefit. You're going to know a ton of kanji already. The only thing you have to fill in then is like pronunciations and how they use words and stuff. You don't have to master a whole new set of writing. Well, I mean, there is the kana, but okay, too much detail. Anyways, the point is, if you already know something that's somewhat related to your topic, the easier it is to learn that topic. And so basically, the more you know about everything, the more you are able to learn even more stuff, even faster, even more efficiently. So I thought that was cool. That actually kind of goes into our number 2, prior knowledge. The more prior knowledge that you have about a topic, the more you can learn other topics, even kind of remotely related to that topic. So there's that. Another thing too is Okay, so the third one is the curse of knowledge. And the idea is that people who have mastered a certain skill or set of information, it's hard for them to go back to help a beginner because the process of mastery involves getting a lot of information and then kind of chunking it together and forming a mental map. And when you have a mental map, it's like you've condensed the information into a really compact package in your mind, and it's hard for you to like break it apart and see all those components once again as a beginner would, because they don't have the same background that you do. So it turns out that if you want to learn something really, really well, it doesn't hurt to observe the masters, but actually some of the best people who can teach you the most are the people who are just a few steps ahead of you. Kind of your peers. Peer teachers often are more effective at teaching than master teachers because they're only a few steps ahead. They haven't had as much experience and time to create super elaborate, compact mental maps. So they still can kind of understand where you are and teach you as a near beginner themselves. So those are some interesting principles that I learned from the book. And then let's move to the action items. So with the first one, the testing effect. So with testing, basically the idea, there's also, I'm kind of relating this to another concept which is called reflection, and they said one of the best ways to learn is to reflect on what you've learned. And ideally you want to reflect pretty soon after you've learned something. This is something that my music teacher actually told me once, which is you want to reinforce anything that you've learned in a lesson within 24 hours, because after that the memory just goes away really fast. I didn't always follow her advice, but yeah, I mean, if I was the best student, that's what I would have done. Anyways, so there's like 3 questions that you can ask when you're trying to reinforce information, and then there's 3 questions you can ask when you're trying to reinforce skills. So the 3 questions for information are, number 1, what are the key points of the idea or the chapter or whatever it is that I just read or that I just heard in the lecture? And then the second question is, what are some examples, like concrete specific examples of this idea that I can think about? If you're thinking of, say, a physics concept, you can try to think about some real life things. Like if you're learning about gravity, you can think about gymnastics or something, people falling or jumping. You know, you get the idea. Think of something concrete. Examples that are relevant to you, because another aspect of learning is how meaningful something is to you determines how well you remember it. Okay, and then the third question is, how does what I just learned relate to something I already know? Which I think I kind of already covered. So, okay, let's summarize that. The first one, what are the key points? Number 2, what are examples? Number 3, how does this relate to something I already know? So, or you already know, related to your personal experience. Then for the 3 questions for skills are, number 1, what went well just now when I was practicing this new skill? And then number 2 is what could have gone better? And then number 3 is what should I try next time to get better results? And actually, I do this myself when it comes to art, because I've been learning some art, just something that I've always wanted to do, and I just like never got around to it. Now I finally do, and one thing that I've been challenging myself to reflect on is these 3 questions. I think I actually do the last 2 questions more, what I could have done better and what I'll do next time. Those are the 2 questions I ask myself after every session, after every art session. Okay, so that's one practical application. The second one is generation, right to learn. So generation is another principle that they covered in the book, which is that knowledge stays with you more if you actually use it for something. And one of the best ways to immediately use something that you've learned is to write about it. Because a lot of times, you know, let's say you're learning physics, you don't have time to immediately go out and build a bridge, right? But you can write about it. You can write about anything and everything you learn, which is one of the reasons why I love writing so much. It's one of the greatest things because you can use it to learn anything almost. So anytime you want to learn a new skill or a new piece of knowledge or whatever, write about it. Just take a minute, write a paragraph, and put things into your own words. And that's one way to really reinforce things. And then the last practical application, overall writing, this is kind of more of my personal critique on the book. I thought the book was really good. I really liked the ideas. I think for me personally would have helped if they organized it slightly differently, like maybe had a section at the end where they just go over the key principles one at a time, maybe alphabetically or chronologically would make more sense, and just give one really succinct example. They did try to give several examples of these processes being applied in real life, but I think I would have liked to see every single one of the processes that they talk about listed out, either each one with a separate example or one fictional example that uses all of them in order. That would have helped, but really small potatoes. Overall, I thought this was an excellent book. I would give it definitely at least 5 stars, if not 6. The only thing for me, like I said, was the organization thing. Parts of it were a little, there were some parts that were slightly repetitive, and there were some concepts that seemed a little bit hard to suss out. Like they were talking about interleaving and varied practice, and I thought that's the same thing, right? So there were some points of confusion in there. But I think the most important parts I've extracted and presented here. And yeah, that is Make It Stick by Peter Brown et al. And if you are interested in more book chats and breakdowns, keep an eye on this channel. And feel free to pick up your free article checklist at beabrilliantwriter.com. And that's it for now. Keep on being a brilliant writer and spread light.